Hi everyone and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to take ourselves a bit of a look around the site. The forestry work has now been completed. There's a bit of timber left at the bottom to pick up, but for the most part it's all off the hill. No more big machines on the hill, so it's a good opportunity for us to sort of see the state it's been left in and have a little bit of chat about what the future for Revolution Bike Park is. So I'm at the top of the hill today and it is pretty blustery, and this is kind of one of the points we sort of made when we talked about the reasons for closing and the reason it's difficult to operate this site without the trees. Today it's September, it's the latter part of what we call summer in this country, and it's not a particularly dramatic day, but I'm not sure how well you can tell, but it is probably too windy, certainly for 50 to 1 and things like that, even on a fairly modest day like this. So before the next bout of rain comes in, let's go and take a look around the rest of the site. So when we put out some of the previous clips and photos when the forestry work was nearing its end, we got a lot of comments back that sort of were saying, you know, it looks like it's fine, it looks like kind of everything's still there. And when you look from a distance, you can get that impression. It's more when you look in detail. But that being said, you know, there is some good news. There are some things that have survived that we intended to survive and some things that have done better than we expected. So I'm here on the top of the Red Free Ride. You can probably see 50 to 1 in the background behind me, and to be fair, this top section has fared pretty well. As we said all along, 50 to 1 was going to be preserved. The amount of work and investment that went into building that track meant that, you know, we didn't want it to get destroyed. The forestry guys have done a pretty good job of being sensitive to the Red Free Ride, particularly here in the top section. It's a little bit different further down, but here it's actually pretty good. There was a big sort of strip next to it they could work their way down, which would avoid them from having to sort of drive up and down the actual track itself. So top of Free Ride is doing okay. However, you know, as you can see here, and if I certainly turn into the wind, my microphone will probably do a better job. It's really, really windy here, and it'd be quite dodgy even on a fairly nice day like this. So down here in the middle section of the Free Ride, which I know you've seen kind of before because in the previous videos, because this was one of the very first sections to get felled. You know, again, it's still here. You'll probably recognise sort of bridges that I'm on and certain pieces of it behind me. You know, it has taken a severe battering, and you know, there's a difference between it being recognisable and it being rideable and usable for the bike park. You know, when you look at this track in close detail, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't need to essentially do some work to sort of every inch of it in order to get it back up to standard, which is great in a way because you get then a completely brand new, fresh track ready to go, which everyone loves. But obviously it's a lot of work and a lot of money to do that. And so, you know, when you're putting that against the backdrop of the entire hill needing doing, you know, it's not quite as simple as just, you know, let's say, giving it a brush off and reopening it. So the lower section of Free Ride has fared pretty well. The access to the trees above from the uplift road and the construction of a new road on the ghetto track below meant that they didn't need to come in here too much, and so it hasn't actually been too damaged. Again, it would need a fair refresh job, which again, you know, at the end of it you'd have a much nicer track than, you know, when we closed, but obviously still a lot of work to do that. And it's an interesting point to note on this section, and something else that we have to be aware of across the park is sort of deterioration over time. It's an interesting thing, but actually, whilst riding trails obviously causes erosion and damage to them, it also helps to maintain them. Generally what happens is, riding, the bikes grind up the surface, particularly when it's this sort of slaty material, and it keeps that sort of fine layer of dust, which creates a bit more of a smoother, although braking bumps obviously aside, surface. When that goes, what happens is over time the track keeps getting rained on, the finer material gets washed away, and you end up with this kind of much bigger, rockier surface. So it is one of those things that the longer we wait, the more work it's going to be to rebuild. But given that we're looking at essentially a full rebuild anyway, it's not kind of the end of the world. The other thing to be aware of is nature. None of these tracks are tarmacked or surfaced. We didn't come in here and kill a lot of the plants to make way for them. And as soon as people stop riding on them and stop keeping the riding surface clear, nature wants to reclaim it. So if I stand here again a year from now, 18 months from now, this will likely all be green and all be grown over. So yeah, something else to be aware of. But like I say, it needs a rebuild. It's already gone beyond the point where we'd be happy just sort of opening it and letting people ride it. So it's kind of much too much. So another one of the tracks that has fared pretty well through the works is Farside. A couple of reasons for that. Number one is the middle section was rebuilt after the last felling work, so there wasn't any need to go back into that section. But also we took the decision to leave a sort of protective barrier of trees along the border, partly to help with wind breakup for potential future tracks, but also as a bit of a shelter for the new trees that get planted. It's a bit of a gamble. It's quite a thin band right up against the sort of prevailing wind direction, and there's a big chance that it may end up getting blown down. Basically winter will tell for us this year if that's going to happen. If it gets through winter this year, they've got a chance to sort of fill out and sort of firm up. They've got a better chance in the future, but a big storm could knock it down and ruin Farside. But yeah, in general, because the Farside line at the top section was used as a sort of barrier for where to stop felling, obviously they didn't need to go over the track, and it meant that most of it survived in pretty good condition. Other good news, as we said right from the start, we were going to sort of save Vision Line, and we have very much done that. As you can see in the background, it looks a lot different to what it used to. There's no trees or anything here, but it has been more or less untouched. Less successful or less good news is Revit line, which was our sort of dirt jumpy type line, which is below the fire road. That has been, well, I mean, that's completely gone at this point. They've had to go through there with the machines, and they've kind of used chunks of it as a road below the main fire road. But, like I say, the beautiful artwork that is Vision Line is at least still mostly there. I mean, it's worth saying that although Vision Line and several other tracks like 50 and bits of Freeride are still here, they are not in any way rideable in their current state. It would be really dangerous for anyone to try and ride them. Which is partly why, obviously we can't just open the doors and do some riding here, but also it's a bit of a warning that, this is a private site, it's a dangerous site, particularly in its current state, and these tracks, whilst we might be able to do the odd jump, are not going to be rideable, and certainly not for the foreseeable future. So please, don't get ideas that you could come here and ride these. So now on to the more bad news of the hill. So essentially the downhill tracks in the central part of the hill is what's taken the most damage. I'm here on what used to be the top side of Ginger Bobcat, and to be honest, it's kind of completely gone. I can see off in the distance the wooden drop that was a part of it, and I can see the sort of starting ramps here. But other than that, everything in between is kind of gone. The far side jump section has fared a bit well. It was a bit wider, but it still, would need a complete rebuild for that to be sort of safe and usable for the public. And as well as the sort of, tracks like this that need completely rebuilding, as I've stood here in the center of it, hopefully you can sort of see the difference, the amount of sort of brush and branches that would need to be cleared. all of these sort of higher stumps that would need to be sort of sanitized and made safer. You know, it's all doable, you know, nothing to say that it can't be done, but it's not quite as simple as, you know, spending a half a day with a blower and then, you know, putting the Land Rovers back on the hill and reopening. You know, to keep a site like this safe, you need to, you know, it's not just about the actual surface of the track, the safety areas around it that need to be maintained and things like that. And it's just, you know, it's a lot more work than just, you know, give it a sweep and call it a day and open up again. So we're going to head further down the hill now and have a look at some of the tracks in the middle section, and yeah, you'll see sort of things only kind of get worse the further down we go. Another track that hasn't fared particularly well is Mainline. I'm stood here at the junction, which many of you may remember, where you've got the sort of red downhill, goes off that way in Ghetto, and then Mainline carries off down the hill here, and you've got the little drop behind me here. From here to start box, it's gone, there's nothing left. And from here down, you know, it's a bit of a mess. It could be tidied up potentially. But yeah, it's been pretty damaged. Red downhill, it still exists predominantly from this point. It's where it crosses the next fire road that it starts to get really damaged. But let's wander down, we'll have a look, go down to the next fire road and see what the Mainline looks like at the crossing. Somewhere here, but to be honest, I can't figure out exactly where. So it may have taken a little bit to actually find the crossing point, but I found it, and I'm stood now at just after the first fire road. Got Mainline heading off behind me and L1 heading down the hill. Yeah, I mean, this section is, like I say, it's virtually unrecognisable. Obviously you can see a few of the sort of stumps and things like that, the retaining logs that we put in. And again, you know, it's kind of here, but you know, you're still talking several weeks, you know, of work, pretty hard labour to clear it, reshape it, sort the drainage, you know, get it back to a point where it's workable. Again, you know, it's savable. I'm not saying it could never be saved, but it's just a fair chunk of work to get it to a point where you'd feel safe opening it up to the public. Now, I know Mainline and L1 may not have been the most popular tracks on the hill, but these tracks, and particularly this point on the hill, hold a certain special memories for me. For those who don't sort of know, this was the first track we ever built. L1 particularly, there was already a bit of a sort of scraped out line that some locals had built and been riding, but it was, you know, it was completely unrideable from a sort of public's perspective. And the point that I'm stood on here, which is the as you dropped off the fire road, if you went down L1, there's sort of a berm here which sort of caught you, as it was a lot steeper before the machine sort of bulldozed it out. This was actually the very first thing we ever built on this hill, and I actually built this on my own. You know, many of you know James is the main builder. He does all the building work. I just sort of do the business side of it. And I can't 100% remember why, but I think maybe I moved up a little bit earlier. And this section here was one of the more difficult bits to get through. So one day I brought a couple of shovels up on my own and built a bit of a catch berm. Like I say, that was the very first thing that was ever built at Revolution Bike Park. Has been rebuilt by James and the crew many times over since then, and they did a much better job of it than I ever did. But yeah, it's sort of a special place this for us because, you know, Mainline was our first track. Well, I mean, technically L1 was our first track, but then it was sort of extended and turned into Mainline. And it was called Mainline because at the time it was our main line. We had a couple of little offshoots in places, but that was the main line, the main track at the hill. And that's where that kind of name came from. So no tour of Mainline would be complete without the infamous Banana Skin Corner. This section of the hill has caught out many a rider over the years. I remember us making the mistake a few years back of including the section of track in a borderline regional race, where I think we came pretty close to setting the record for the number of red flags on race runs, something like 40 to 60 people coming off on this section alone. It's always been an interesting section because it's one of the steepest parts of the hill, and it's always been a challenge to kind of get around. You know, originally L1 came straight down the hill and it was sort of really steep and scary, so we decided we would build a couple of traverses out here, which is what Mainline became, but that slammed us into this chunk of bedrock and created an almost scarier section than L1. A few years later, we then came back and actually built Collins Corners, which was a whole new section of track from the first fire road down to this point, and that in itself became very steep and scary. So this has always been, you know, one of the more tricky parts of the hill. As it stands right now, you know, it's a bit of a wasteland. I mean, at least there's some earth on it. It's not just bare slate bedrock. It might actually be nicer to ride right now, but it would soon turn to slop and mush. Yeah, so it's a bit sad to say this is one of the iconic sections on the hill, and it's, you know, kind of no more. So one of the major victims of this whole job has been the red downhill track. You know, for those who maybe not familiar with the park, that was our sort of secondary free ride, sort of mini free ride track. Started on the sort of up near the uplift drop off and went down to sort of the bottom of the diagonal fire road at the bottom of Vision. The first section of it, it's been pretty heavily damaged, particularly a little bit further than you can see here. But you can kind of see it still exists from there. The major problem has been the next section. As you can see, it has been completely destroyed. Basically, we needed an extra road to access the middle section. The diagonal fire road we didn't really want to use because that would have meant basically destroying the Vision line, and we really wanted to preserve that. So we kind of made the decision to abandon red downhill and let them use it as a road for the forestry machinery. The main benefit of that, potentially for the future though, is that, you know, we have this completely stripped and cut out line, which is obviously ideal if you want to build a new free ride line. And whilst plans are still in the air, and we'll talk about that a bit later on, the thinking is that the free ride section, which also comes down to this area, would essentially link to that to basically double its length. So we would take it all the way down there and then cut it back across to join in with the original. So as we come into the bottom section of the downhill tracks, things don't get much better, unfortunately. Down to my right behind me here, this road was formerly ghetto track. Again, we needed a road to access the trees, and so we had to pick a track to choose, and it was ghetto that lost it. I'm stood here on Ready McRedface. You might be able to recognise the sort of bermy, twisty nature of it. This hasn't been driven over. You can still sort of roughly see the shape of it, but I mean, it would require, you know, a complete rebuild for it to be, you know, anywhere near the sort of quality required to open it up. So looking further behind me here, for those who know the park, just to give you some context, if you look at this line of giant broadleafs, just below them is where Mainline ran. They kind of built onto an old stone wall, or they're sort of grown onto an old stone wall. So, you know, you came down here and then the river crossing was essentially this dried up riverbed in front of the big broadleafs. Again, to do that section, you know, they've had to basically tear it completely to pieces. Might be interesting, what you maybe didn't realise is how much further down the forest went from Mainline. Like I say, these trees here, Mainline is just the other side of it. Part of the reason for that is the topography of the hill. You can see it now more clearly than you would have been before. This wall kind of leads down to the lowest part of our land at the end of the forest. So the further we go down that way, the more of an uphill you've got to get back to the, let's say, the end of the forest. So it actually meant there's quite a lot of space down there that we've never been able to utilise. Maybe at some point in the future we might be, if we can acquire any sort of linking land. But yeah, like I say, there's actually quite a lot more land down there than you imagine, you know, or imagine before seeing the trees cut down. So I appreciate a lot of this video might seem a little bit pessimistic, like I've been sort of taking you around and pointing you at all the woes and all the damage and all that sort of it. And to a certain extent it has been that, and it is that. You know, this is a difficult process for us in many ways. But in terms of whether it means, you know, is it savable, don't take my pessimism to mean it's not savable. An analogy I would use is, you know, let's say you bought an old vintage car that was wrecked and everything like that, and then you spent 10, 12 years putting all of your time and love and money into building it up, and then it became this sort of perfect factory, original, beautiful sort of thing. And then one morning you came out and it had been vandalized and scratched and all the windows were broken and paint poured in it and the engine destroyed. You know, if someone said to you, well, can you rebuild it? Well, the answer is yes, you can rebuild it. You started with a wreck and you built it into this beautiful thing. but it's you know, it was a hard road to go to make that transformation, and to do it again is also difficult. The other thing about coming back is when we first started 12 years ago, there was very few sort of full-time official sort of bike parks like this in the country. We were sort of ahead of the game, which meant that we could kind of build up slowly and organically, you know, starting with one sort of rough track and a couple of Land Rovers, and then over the years building up better and better tracks, better and better sort of uplift, more and more vehicles, more and more people. The world has moved on from then. You know, now there are plenty of sort of really good bike parks around the country. I think there's still room for more, and I think there's still room for Revolution to return, but there are plenty of other options for people to go and ride, and we've built a reputation for having some great tracks, and we don't want to just sort of reopen with one sort of track competing with everyone else. And although I'm sure you'd all rush back and you'd all support us, you know, it would be perfectly understandable for you guys to go, well, this is a park has more to offer than Revolution right now, so I'm going to go and ride there instead. That's what I would do, that's what anyone would do. So we don't want to, you know, if we're going to come back, we want it to be at least sort of at the level of we were at before. So that brings me to what is the future from this point. We're kind of at the not the bottom of the barrel, I'll say. There's still sort of certainly ways that things could get worse, but all of the destruction has been done, the machines have gone, the hill is at its sort of most desolate sort of time and weather erosion allowing. So where do we go from here? Well, because it's taken quite a while to look around the hill and to show you everything, I am going to leave this on a cliffhanger and say where we're going to go from here will be in the next video we're going to do, which should come out in the next few weeks. We have been sort of having lots of conversations and lots of sort of figurings out in the meantime, and whilst we don't have a sort of clear here's the answer right now, we do have more information to share in terms of what our plans are and what our focus is going to be in the next year or two. So I want to thank you so much for stopping by and watching the video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, hopefully you found it interesting. I'm sure you're going to have comments and stuff to add. Please feel free to do that. And if you are interested in seeing the next video, particularly what the next step is, then please remember to subscribe and like and all that. You know, we want to sort of try and keep relevant and remind you guys that we still exist, so that really helps support the channel. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next one.